So what are we still missing in this international conversation about cancer, since it's still the big C, very scary word?
The fact that 1 in 2 of us are going to experience it in our lifetime, that's the current statistic. The fact that it now overshadows cardiovascular disease as the #1 cause of death in industrialized countries, you would think that people would be talking about it more. So a really good example is yesterday we had like a meet and greet table thing during lunch, and all of the tables were full, like tables on hormones, tables on thyroid dysfunction, tables on all the topics. I sat by myself at the cancer table.
Whoa.
No one wants to talk about the big C.
Wow.
And so that's part of what I'm trying to change, is change the narrative, because our culture has created a cancerous culture of like fear, right? And disconnect and disempowerment.
And war. All the metaphors around cancer are war.
Yeah. It was declared a war on cancer by the Nixon administration in 1971. And understandably so. We were coming out of World War I, Korean War, World War II, Vietnam was still happening. So globally, we have an ethos around war, and that was a good metaphor. But the waging of war on cancer hasn't changed outcomes. And what's really interesting is when we start to understand that cancer is us, we all have cancer cells all the time. Why would you want to wage war on yourself?
That's a really good question. The most upset a colleague has ever gotten at me was when I was getting interviewed by a cancer expert on her platform. And I said, because cancer is the body's healing response and we want to respect it and work with it. And she got so upset. So what is this disconnect we have in the different factions of health professionals today about war on cancer versus, the opportunity of cancer?
I want to honor people's experience with anything, right? We meet our biggest challenges differently. I personally get upset or concerned when I see that. Can I throw F-bombs here?
Absolutely.
So the Fuck Cancer campaigns, I mean, literally that is a massive sort of brand, and there's that people just get into this embattled place. But then at the same token, if somebody does die from cancer, then we're like, they lost their battle. All of these different things happen around this concept. And so people get very upset with me as well when I talk about maybe we should reconsider this, because the battle approach, the war on cancer approach, has not served us well. So maybe it's time to have a different dialogue, especially given the rates of cancer and the outcomes of cancer that we have today compared to even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. When folks are so triggered by that, there is this sort of perception that this is an enemy, that it's outside of you, and that it's waging war against you, that there's something very personal about it, instead of recognizing that actually it's trying to tell you something. And so I really loved the language that you chose to use when you got in trouble, is that it really is something. I mean, cancer is the ultimate disconnect and the ultimate breakdown of communication, from organelle to organelle, from cell to cell, from tissue to tissue, organ to organ, meat suit to meat suit. It's just, this is what's happened. And yet we can restore those cancer cells back into the fold of its original community. And we can change the cellular expression in so many ways today, versus just killing off bad guys. You can actually remind them that they're part of the whole.
So what is the process of doing that?
Well, you got to evaluate. A lot of people go, oh, breast cancer. What do you do for breast cancer? Or what do you do for prostate cancer? What do you do for brain cancer? I get asked these questions all the time, as if they're all distinct entities, and as if there is a single target and a single treatment for each and every one of those. That's not the process. We need to scrape away the naming of cancer through its origin, its tissue origin. That would be a really good starting point, is just to say cancer is a process, not an event. Just because it shows up in the breast does not mean it has a unique personality compared to others. It's the individual that it shows up in that's unique, not the tissue that it shows up in that's unique. And so we start with this test, assess, address. It's a methodology I've created over 34 years from my own terminal diagnosis, and have helped tens of thousands of other patients directly and hundreds of thousands indirectly to understand the why of the expression of their cancer process. And so we start by evaluating. So testing, all the basics, right? Blood tests, tissue and blood biopsies, imaging, questionnaires or tests as well, right? Evaluations, even looking at people's adverse childhood event scores, even looking at wearable data like HRV, heart rate variability, looking at continuous glucose monitor data, looking at the environment in, on, and around them, and testing for that, like functional medicine testing, looking for those poisons, because those are a lot of new things in our world. And then the second step is assess. What does all that data mean? What patterns are being elucidated from all that information that we just gathered from testing? And then when we find that pattern, we find various tools to address that pattern. And that's the address part of the show. And at the end of the day, you don't guess. So test, assess, address, don't guess. When you follow that methodology, the tool means very little at the end of the day. It's the why, right? There's a million hows, but the why is what's important. So I think standard of care fails because it's constantly trying to just say, oh, you have breast tumor, this is the treatment. And it skips the why did you have the breast tumor? Is that treatment specific for your why? And then guess what? That same disconnect happens in the functional and integrative oncology space too. Everyone's like, well, I'll just replace the chemo with high dose IVC or hyperbaric oxygen or something else sexy, whatever the soup du jour is, but they're not asking the why either. So we need to change that conversation because when it comes down to it, that why is so critical of the what and the how, and how do we change the conversation? And that's what ultimately leads to, what was this cancer trying to tell you? What message was it getting that it's trying to tell you now? And what can we do about it?
And for us, we spend so much time working people recovering from mold toxicity, all those inflammatory illnesses that come up from being poisoned by heavy metals and those endocrine disruptors and microplastics and parasites. And so we often get people in the gut, disturbance stage. If you don't resolve those early signs, things will progress to cancer because all those classes of toxins are carcinogens. So what are the early presentations that a body is experiencing root cause issues that, before we get to cancer? What are some of those earlier pathogenic stages?
First sign of something happening in somebody is actually fatigue. And people are like, wait, what? I mean, if you're a practitioner on this planet today, 80% of your patients are going to come in and their primary concern is fatigue. And I'm talking the fatigue that is not like resolved with a nap. This is the fatigue that's like just this insidious, deep exhaustion. Fatigue is a sign of just energy mismanagement or energy production issues. And that gets traced back to this very ancestral process in our bodies that we've co-evolved with for millions and millions of years, which is down to these very little organelles, these little organs within our cells that started out as bacterium that now make up upwards of 20% of our body composition, which is pretty remarkable if you think about that. These little guys are the mitochondria. And what we are taught from like 6th grade biology is that they just simply make ATP, energy. Yes, they do that, but they do so much more. Here's what I think is really interesting about the poisons conversation. When you look at like the poisons, yes, they're a problem, but what are they doing to create a problem? What is at the root of each of those poisons? Like this is where the mitochondria come in. So the mitochondria has bigger jobs than just making ATP. It has 3 major jobs. Its first job is it receives a lot of information. It is constantly scanning and taking in food, water, light, nutrients, poisons, antibiotics, stress, all the things. It's the collector of the information putting in, on, and around you of people, places, and things. That's the very first job of the mitochondria. It's surveillance, right? Its second job is translation. That part of the job is, what does all that stuff mean? Wow, there's a lot coming in at us today, more than ever before. In just a matter of a couple of generations, we have things exposed to our bodies today that never existed 2 generations ago on a daily basis coming at us. That's a big piece. So the translation says, whoa, there's a lot of information and overwhelm. The third job is communication, signaling out to tell the surrounding organelles, the surrounding cytoplasm, the surrounding cells, tissues, organs, construct what to do with that information. Does that sound familiar to test, assess, address? All of the things that you talk about, all the things I talk about in my Terrain 10, these are the things that impact and are information to the mitochondria. And our very longevity is mitochondrial dependent. Our cellular longevity, our tissue longevity, our organ longevity, and our entire chronological longevity is 100% dependent on our mitochondria and the information we feed those mitochondria and how we make sense of that. And then what do we do with that information?